Thank you, Father Paul Mark. It was interesting to hear what you would say about the introduction because I was told it would be about the spirituality of our chapter house, our architecture. And first, I don't like the word spirituality because today it means almost anything. And I'm happy to hear the word relationship because, because the buildings we build shows a lot about our relationship with God. On the other hand, Cistercian architecture is quite problematic. The very first Cistercians had a simple stone church. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but probably was something built according to the style of the late 1000s. St. Bernard himself started out with what we would call a barn that would turn into a monastery. Eventually, a beautiful monastery was built. And today, Cistercians throughout the world build all kinds of structures characteristic of the country in which they live. And as one monk told me many years ago, we used to have in our order a committee that supervised all the buildings to make sure they were appropriate and kind and that would be adequate for a monastery. And this monk, having looked at pictures that were from communities throughout the world, suggested maybe we need to reinstitute this committee because you find all kinds of variety of buildings. So I'm going to speak about the relationship to God that this building here speaks of. At one end, we find the Romanesque style. The windows, the walls are thick, the windows have a round top, and the rest of this building, the chapter house as it was originally, is in the early Gothic style. So this building represents a period in our architecture when the monks were moving from Romanesque to Gothic and early Gothic. Later Gothic example would be Notre Dame in Paris. That would be a late Gothic. This is early Gothic. Minimalist architecture, which is very much in vogue today, uses light and space to focus upon a form, a style that is highly geometric. We have a monastery in Europe that is built, in the church anyway, and one cloister is built according to the minimalist style. Obviously, there is no decoration in the life. The cloister is quite unique. You look down the cloister, it's white walls. The lines point towards the door, because when you enter a hallway, you're going to somewhere. So the door at the far end, everything converges on the door. On the side that faces the outside are the windows in one long, unbroken stream of glass that also points to the door. No decorations, painted white, it's spacious, functional. The architecture we have in this building here is quite different, and it represents early Cistercian, because it has the principles of early Cistercian architecture. And I have kind of broken these principles down into three categories. First is I refer to as physical. The building, the material you see in there is stone. It's authentic. Today, when we build with technology, we have all kinds of possibilities. We can have something that looks like wood, it smells like wood, it feels like wood, but it isn't wood. It'll last a long time. It'll outdo the endurance of wood. And the time this building was put together, the material was very authentic. And so that's one characteristic on the level of the physical. that in our relationship to God, it's important that we be authentic persons. And I'll let you decide how to define authentic. To be a real person before God. Something authentic. The seed sown, it's sown. It's not poured concrete painted to look like stone. It's real stone. The second level, I would put in terms of rational. And by rational, I mean that is the architect, the person that put this building together, used form or shape. It has a shape. They use space. It has a lot of space. They use light as much as possible. From this end, it's open, so light could come in. The other end is Romanesque, where light is very controlled because they needed the support for the buildings, the upper buildings, a foundation. And in addition to that, they also use proportion. Things are in relationship to one another. They're not, one column is not too big, it doesn't fit, they all fit. Proportion is important in structure. And as a result, there was a certain harmony. Moreover, they use very obviously geometric designs. For example, the column, the lower column there, and the wind up there is very geometric. It's an 11-sided column, the tiny one, 11 sides to it, and the top is the ochreous window as a cook's carving, which is probably put in by Mudehar workers, which would be Muslim craftsmen working under Christian employers. And so that is an Islamic influence in early Gothic architecture. And later Gothic architecture does have certain aspects of Islamic influence. So we are very proud to have this modest proportion of our Gothic portal due to an Islamic influence. And in Gothic architecture, the arches are pointed, whereas Romanesque are round, in order to be able to support a higher wall and open up and to have light coming in. But it's all harmony. And so the point there is it's capable of using our mind and our relationship with God to reason, as we call it today, rational, that we act in a reasonable way, otherwise our life is not harmonious. And so this aspect of our church is put together in proportion, form, relation, and harmony, light, space, to give a sense of harmony. Hopefully it will influence the monks who come here in the future to see an integrated unit, and they will strive over the years to integrate their own lives as we strive now to integrate our lives in relationship to God. We're not functional. This leads then into the third relationship, which I would or the third aspect of Cistercian architecture, which I would style as experience. When a person walks into this building or comes in contact with it, they are struck by its beauty, its magnificence, its authenticity, if you want to put it that way, its harmony, and there's a sense of awe. And this, I think, is the final aspect of our relationship with God, to be in awe of God. to think that this building was created beautifully centuries ago, and it still speaks of the magnificence of God. And that's why the early Cistercians used architecture, at least in the early 12th and 13th centuries. Now, later, they moved to more contemporary materials and the like. But at that period, their buildings spoke of their awe for God. And the church should be that way when we enter the church. It should be like we're coming into the presence of God, and the presence of God is one of all. That's the best way we can describe God. So in a nutshell, that is how our early Cistercian buildings, especially this particular one, and the ones that are contemporary in this period, they are mainly in southern France, although those Cistercian monasteries tend to militate towards Romanesque, whereas in Spain, this contemporary tend to militate towards Gothic because Gothic was coming into style at the time. These buildings built by the monks were buildings that inspired awe because they built for God. They didn't build to be functional. They were functional, obviously, but they built primarily because of a relationship with God. And so there is a Cistercian relationship to God manifested in stone, because stone does two things. This building does two things. It gives a sense of life. You look at the stone, and if you visualize, you can see something happening. You see the arches, the kind of life there. And the center columns, how the vaulting goes up from them, gives a sense of a fountain, of movement captured in stone. Even the arch itself, there's a sense of life there. It's just not a plain wall with a door or an opening. And furthermore, it also gives a spirit of life. Walking into the building, a certain spirit of awe. Awe gives life. When we are in wonder and overwhelmed by the beauty of something, we have a certain spirit within us. It brings to birth a certain spirit within us, a spirit of awe, reverence, and delight. It's wonderful to be able to pray in this building, to pray in this church with this and the most chant there. So there we have it in a nutshell, how this building, the building we're standing in, is built not to be functional, but to show a relationship with God. Now, I think we have time for a few questions, but I must warn you that I am in between and not yet. My hearing aids have served their purpose and have gone kaput. The new ones have not arrived. So I may or may not hear the questions. I'll have to be articulated. There's one advantage of not being hearing clearly is most of the time I think our choir sounds rather raucous. Coming from a family of musicians on both sides for several generations. I like good music, but without hearing aids, they sound rather mellow and nice. So it's really drums. Could be the angels. So if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them, but I don't know if I'll be able to.
No, thank you, Father. I don't know if there is an clear answer, but I just kind of wonder how the designers of the early Gothic style in that time actually came up with these concepts of arches and the awesomeness, of the vaulting and the movement. From a 21st century perspective, it seems awesome that they were able to conceptualize in this way, much less build such a
I think you're basically asking how Gothic was became a part of the building process.
Sure. Yeah, that's
I
cool.
wish that I could hear anyway. Well, to make a long story short, Gothic was the latest fad going on at the time. And as it was explained to me, they started to build, I think, Pontigny in France is a Cistercian monastery. It's up to the parish church. The church is rather huge. And those who are sensitive to architecture can look at the building and see where part of it is Romanesque, part is Gothic. It was built at the time when Gothic was first coming into vogue. And so the monks learned to be on the cutting edge of architecture. So they took Gothic and incorporated it into their mentality at the time. And of course, it was easy from one point of view because the materials they had to use was authentic. It was stone and so on. But the style was different. And so they moved, and later on, especially some of the abbeys in England were highly developed Gothic, which is a much later period. Like as I mentioned earlier, the Cathedral of Chartres, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Rievaulx, and the fountains were much the same way that they had been destroyed for the most part. So the monks were using the latest. There's one thing about the Cistercian Quakerism is the monks were on the cutting edge of technology as it was being developed in the early Middle Ages. And so they incorporated Gothic into their buildings and so on, but using it in a monastic way.